So welcome everybody to today's webinar. The title is Spatial and Temporal Distribution of the St. Vincent Amazon Using Passive Acoustic Monitoring. We're very grateful to have with us two of our presenters today, which I'll give you a little background information on their bio. Dr. Cristina Gomes is a conservation biologist and behavioral ecologist with over 2 decades of experience bridging scientific research and applied conservation across Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. Since 2022, she has collaborated with the St. Vincent Forestry Department to enhance protection of the St. Vincent Amazon through bioacoustic monitoring, habitat analysis, and capacity building. Her work emphasizes data-driven approaches and strong local partnerships. Dr. Gomes currently serves as the Salonga National Park Program Manager for World Wildlife Fund Germany, where she leads publicly and privately funded initiatives focused on bonobo and elephant monitoring, One Health strategies, and anti-poaching efforts in the Congo Basin. Dr. Vijay Ramesh is a postdoctoral research fellow at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He is an ecologist with over a decade of experience in the fields of ornithology, spatial ecology, and conservation technology. His work uses an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach that borrows from conservation bioacoustics, citizen science, and historical ecology. We're very happy to welcome these two speakers today, speaking to us about the St. Vincent Amazon. These promise to be really exciting talks. So welcome everybody to the webinar. And Cristina, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, can you see my presentation and everything is looking good? Because I can't see on my end. Okay,
Yes.
great. Well, welcome everyone. Nice to have so many people here today interested in the St. Vincent Amazon. Thank you, Lisa, for your kind introduction. Just to add, I wanted to say, besides what you already mentioned, I've been working on this project with numerous collaborators, mainly the St. Vincent Forestry Department. So this has been a very broad and collaborative venture between many organizations, and I would want to first and foremost thank the Forestry Department for all their support in doing this wonderful work that hopefully will lead to insightful results and understanding of the St. Vincent Parrot's, St. Vincent Amazon's ecology and conservation. So yeah, I wanted to first go over the agenda for today. So I'm first going to give a brief introduction to the St. Vincent Amazon. I'll then do an overview of previous monitoring efforts in St. Vincent, then talk a little bit about our current survey and the methods that we used. And then Dr. Vijay Ramesh is going to go over the results, a general discussion, and some suggestions that we have for the Conservation Action Plan. All right, so the St. Vincent Amazon, or Amazona gildingi, is a true parrot from the family Cetacidae. It's endemic to St. Vincent, and it's the national bird. It has a large size. It's one of the largest parrots. It can measure from 40 to 45 centimeters in length. It has vibrant plumage, and we generally find two morphs. The yellow morph is predominantly bronze brown in the upper parts with a pale head, yellow, blue, and orange tail, and greenish bronze underpart. So this is the morph that we're seeing in this picture. And then there's a less common green morph that has similar yellow-brown, it's similar to the yellow-brown morph, but with more prominent green coloration on the back. This species is restricted to the island and has a small population of around 1,000 individuals, and that makes it very vulnerable to human activities and environmental changes. So the IUCN Red List categorized it as vulnerable. The St. Vincent Amazon is long-lived, approximately 15 years, and it feeds mostly on fruits, seeds, and flowers. Some of the species that it feeds on is monkey goblet, tree, pennypiece, Spanish ash tree.
Cristina, you're muted.
Okay. It nests mostly in cavities of tall, mature trees, so it also is very dependent on old growth. Group sizes can vary, but commonly observed groups are of 20 to 30 individuals. And its breeding season is from January to June. So it usually mates in January at the beginning of the year, starts laying eggs at the end or beginning of the year, starts laying eggs in February. And that's when usually the forestry department starts putting out nesting boxes. And then we can start seeing fledglings in April, May. So they mostly are found in montane rainforest between 125 and 1,000 meters in altitude. They prefer high canopy cover and generally prefer where they can find large fruiting trees. Their historic distribution, and they've been found core populations in Boucament, Vermont, and Cumberland Valley. So here at the left, you can see a historical map that is, I've seen it used all over the place, and I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but it's usually considered to be the historical distribution of the species. But here in the second map to the right, we can see the eBird sightings of the St. Vincent Amazon. And so you can see that they've been sighted all over the island in the areas where there is forest between 125 and 1,000 meters in altitude. So to this southern part is mostly the city, and then this northern tip here where they're not found at either is the volcano, La Soufrière. There have been various population estimates across the years done by different authors and also using various estimation methods. So, but basically the last three that you can see here in 2010, 21, and 22 were done by the Forestry Department of St. Vincent. And you can see that those estimations don't vary a whole lot. Because their range is so limited, then their population size is relatively low, of around 1,000 individuals. They're very vulnerable to human activities and environmental changes. And so that's why they were classified as vulnerable. And some of the threats that affect the St. Vincent Amazon are habitat loss, so small-scale agriculture, charcoal production, illegal marijuana cultivation, which is very common across the island, and logging. So they rely a lot on these mature trees, and which makes them particularly vulnerable to habitat loss, but also to other issues like natural disasters. So hurricanes and volcanic eruptions have also impacted the parrot significantly. Well, we believe there aren't really any studies that have focused on the impact of hurricanes and volcanic eruptions. And so that's one of the things that we're going to focus on in the studies that we're doing. Poaching and pet trade. So the illegal capture for the pet trade remains a concern. And so is the exportation of parrots from the island for alleged conservation purposes, which have recently raised concerns about the transparency and potential commercialization of these parrots for conservation efforts, so alleged conservation efforts. Invasive species are also a concern. So non-native predators can target eggs and chicks, and this can add further pressure to the species. And then climate change is also expected to exacerbate these key threats to the St. Vincent Amazon and increase the frequency and intensity of hurricanes. So I wanted to talk first about some of the surveys that have been done in St. Vincent. The St. Vincent Forestry Department throughout the years have done several large-scale inventory surveys of the St. Vincent Amazon, where they monitor 20 watch points, so 4 points in 5 ranges. So you can see here in black, these black dots are the watch points that they have set out across the island. So in the northern eastern part on the leeward side, you can see these 4 points. This is Richmond. Then you can see Cumberland, 4 more points. Then Vermont, 4 more points. And then here you can see South Rivers, 4 more points, and then to the north here, Congo Valley. So those are the watch points that the Forestry Department established more than 20 years ago, and in these 5 ranges. And then they also established 10 more gap watch points, which are meant to fill in, so as the word says gap, they're meant to fill in the areas that are not surveyed by the watch points. And basically what this consists is that they do these huge 1-week events where they do 3 dawn observations and 3 dusk observations of each watch point. The dawn observations are from 6 to 8 and the dusk from 4 to 6. And basically what they do is that they have 3 people in each site, one observing, one taking data, one securing the area. And they just, as a watch point survey would occur, one person just stands and counts all the parrots that they see passing by, while the other one takes note on and counts on these counts, right? In 2022, they did all the observations simultaneously to avoid double counting. So, I had a little video. I don't know where it went. Okay, that's too bad. But I had a little video where I showed one of the watch points. But basically, here you can see to the left is one of the watch points in Vermont. And you can imagine if somebody's standing here, as you can see in the photos to the right, standing or sitting and counting all the birds that go by, right? We had the fortune of joining the St. Vincent Forestry Department in 2022. And so here are some of my students at one of the watch points collecting data with the Forestry Department. And it's a really large event, and I want to emphasize this. This is only one of the groups, one of the teams in the top right that are serving one of the watch points. So there's a cook, several security people, a driver, and then the team that is actually collecting the data. And in 2022, they did it simultaneously. So they deployed, I think, 40 or 50 people to collect data on all these 30 points. So here you can see the results of the number of parrots per hour in a subset of the watch points. So Richmond in the north and in the northwest, and then Cumberland. So Richmond, we found 35 parrots, 15 parrots. Cumberland, 95 parrots per hour. Vermont, 5 parrots per hour. South River, 35, and Congo Valley, 72 parrots per hour. So this is basically those main range watch points. And then I also added Fenton, and this is Johnson Mountain and Fenton Gap, because they also had large amounts of parrots, so 94 per hour and 43 per hour. And just to give you an idea of that distribution. So the Forestry Department has been doing these surveys for over 20 years. So they started in 2002 is the first record that I found of this large scale survey. They did another one in 2006, another in 2010. Then there was a large gap, and they repeated in 2021, and then again right after the volcanic eruption, and then again in 2022. And 2022 was the one that we were able to participate in. And what I think is interesting to see here is that the number of parrots per hour observed in each of the ranges don't really vary that much per year from one year to another. So it really seems that these large scale surveys can provide useful information on population trends, which is really great to understand how these subpopulations might be changing from one year to another. The St. Vincent Amazon population and distribution seems to remain stable, as I said. But it's not really informative on habitat use, because while we're looking at the number of parrots found in each of these ranges, we're looking at parrots that are flying over the forest and not really interacting with their habitat, or potentially interacting with their habitat. So while they give us some information on the potential number of parrots that are using this large area, we don't really know how they're interacting with the specific point or vegetation habitat that we're collecting the data at. So one question that comes from this is, how do other topographic and land cover variables influence parrot distribution? And to do that, we set out to do a more intricate survey of the St. Vincent Amazon in 2023. And this was part of the International Research Experience for Student project funded by the National Science Foundation to Florida International University. We basically collected data on the same watch points established by the St. Vincent Forestry Department, but limited it to 10 watch points, so 2 points in each of the 5 ranges, and 2 gap watch points, so Fenton and Johnson Mountain, because those were the points where we saw many parrots. We did 3 dusk observations per point, from 4 to 6, determined the observer location, and collected data on direct observation, so detection cue, activity, whether they were perch, flying, nesting, perch to flying or flying to perch, detection of the cue, direction of the flight, and number of individuals. We also collected a variety of vegetation variables. It's very important, we realized, to determine the view shed or range of visibility. So for example, you can see in these photos that in the watch point on the top, there is very little visibility. And in the watch point in the bottom, where my student Ansa Ball is standing and collecting data, there's a lot of visibility. So we thought that this might influence the number of parrots that you can see. So we collected data on the view sheds. So basically trying to determine what is the range of visibility that each viewpoint has, that each watch point has, and then controlled for this. And we realized that actually doesn't matter that much. So it didn't change our results if we controlled for view shed or not. But what it was important for was for determining in which of the watersheds we were going to include each of the watch points. So here you can see the map of St. Vincent divided by watershed. And we decided to do this analysis at the watershed level because of what I was explaining before, that in these watch points, parrots are flying above the watch point. They're not necessarily interacting with the habitat. So it's very hard to then infer how these landscape variables, how vegetation is impacting distribution or parrot density, because they're not actually interacting with the habitat per se. So at a larger watershed level, this analysis might be more informative. So our main question was, can land cover proportions, landscape heterogeneity indicators, and topographic characteristics at the watershed level explain parrot density observations? And so what we did was that delineate watersheds from 2-meter resolution DTM, and we standardized the watch point parrot observation counts by sampling effort and watershed area. So the area of each of these watersheds. This is the parrot density across 2022, 2023, 2 and 3, and averaged for that time. So this is based on 21 and 22, the data collected by the Forestry Department, and in 2023, the data that our team collected. Standardized by effort, of course, for each of these watch points. So Congo Valley is 0.6, Cumberland is 0.2, Fenton 0.5 here to the south, Johnson Mountain 0.3, Richmond 0.1 to the north, South River 0.7, and Vermont 0.4. I mean watershed 4. All right, so basically we included several independent variables into these models and tested model fit. And just to give you an idea of what the topographic and landscape configuration metrics at the watershed level look like, I'm just adding a few here. So slope, for example, slope could be informative or could be important because, for example, intermediate slopes might offer great nesting and foraging sites, especially if they support old large trees, but maybe very steep slopes could be less suitable foraging and nesting habitats, might not be so accessible to parrots. Flat terrain could be developed could be deforested, developed for development, and could be less favorable for the parrots, right? So there could be a mixed effective slope, for example. We also looked at edge density, land cover, so forest, agriculture, and other. Same for land cover. We could expect to find a positive influence of forest percentage because parrots are usually dependent on mature growth for nesting and foraging. And then we also included the percentage of forest area above 1,000 meters. So most known St. Vincent Amazon observations occur below 1,000 meters. So high percentage of forest above 1,000 meter might be less suitable for the parrots, and low percentage of forest below 1,000 meter might be more suitable. So here you can see that there is a lot of, there's a difference between each watershed in how each of these variables interact in each of the watersheds. So right. So, okay. So we included different models. We included each one of these variables in different models and basically found that there was no effect of land cover, edge density, or patch size, and that there was a negative effect of percentage of forest above 1,000 meters. So this is what we expected because above 1,000 meters, most of the times parents aren't found because, as I said, usually it's not good habitat for the parrots. We also found a positive effect of slope, which we expected it could be an interaction effect, a mixed effect, because habitats with a high slope could maybe not be so beneficial for the parrot, and habitats with less of a slope or that are flatter might also have more deforestation. But interpretation of these results have to be done with caution because watch point observations, as I explained before, detect parrots during long flights. and they're not actually interacting with these habitats. However, because the analysis was done at the watershed level, then we could infer, we could conclude that some of these effects are actually informative. Basically, we need more information, more detailed landscape data within each of the watersheds to be able to make better conclusions on how the parrot is interacting with their habitat. Another important study that we did that I wanted to talk to you about a little bit was Vincentian's perception of parrots. So we did interviews across the entire island and asked different questions to Vincentians to understand how they perceive the St. Vincent Amazon. So we asked them, for example, are parrots important to you? And 91% of Vincentians said yes. Some of the reasons that they gave for finding the parrot important was that they were the national animal, they were beautiful, they're important for tourism. This is interesting because it really shows that the St. Vincent Amazon is an important flagship species. Another question that we asked is, should people be allowed to capture parrots? And 87% of Vincentians said no. So they shouldn't be allowed to capture parrots. And some of the answers that they gave was because, and that they gave to why they should be captured or they should be allowed to be captured is because of they should be able to keep them as pets, or they can provide income. And so all this is interesting also to inform management, but also to understand that the St. Vincent Amazon is an important flagship species. It has tremendous value for Vincentians. So the St. Vincent Amazon can serve as a species as a flagship species to protect habitat for others and to attract for other wildlife and to attract further funding for the species, for the habitats that they live in. So the watchpoint surveys basically show that they're useful for understanding the general distribution of the St. Vincent Amazon. They provide important insight into population trends, so whether they're increasing or decreasing. And in this case, we found that the populations in each, the subpopulations in each, or the parrot population across the island has maintained relatively stable in the past 20 years. However, they're costly and time consuming. And we saw big gaps in these surveys throughout the 20 years. And probably that has to do with the high cost of doing these surveys. And as I said, they provide limited insight into habitat use and temporal distribution of the parrots. However, it's really clear that the St. Vincent Amazon is an important flagship species and a very valuable animal to the Vincentians. So one next step is to use other methods to investigate habitat use and temporal distribution of the St. Vincent Amazon. And one method that we could use is passive acoustic monitoring, and that is what we did with the UNDP project that I'm going to talk about in a bit. And also collect detailed landscape data through LiDAR and telemetry, which is a project that now is being led by Dr. Daniel Gunn, one of our collaborators on the project, through NSF funding. So the goal of the UNDP funded project was to investigate the spatial and temporal distribution of the St. Vincent Amazon to inform, through passive acoustic monitoring, to inform the management and the conservation action plan of the parrot. And that is what we're going to continue talking about throughout the rest of this talk. temporal distribution can provide insight into their preferred nesting, roosting, and feeding habitats, and spatial distribution can provide valuable insight into key critical habitats. Passive acoustic monitoring is the use of autonomous recording units to record wildlife sounds. It's based on training AI models to identify sounds automatically. It has an initial high investment of time and money, but afterwards can provide a reliable method to monitor wildlife continuously with a lower investment of funds. So once you have purchased all the equipment and deployed it, then retrieving the monitors requires a much lower investment of time and money. And it might be ideal for the St. Vincent Amazon because, as I said, they fly over the canopy, and so doing transects are challenging. They frequently flush when humans are detected, so so these types of transects can be challenging as well. The terrain in St. Vincent is difficult to access, and that high parrot density across the island requires then very more specific and detailed data. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what these acoustic recordings look like. So this is a spectrogram of one of the birds, and so if it's a broadwing hawk, you can hear vocalization. And one important point to notice here is the amount of background noise and also noise from other species. So the importance of that training data so that you can really identify the species that you're looking to record. Or until you tested hummingbird. And finally, training data becomes very important to ensure that you are picking up on all the different and successfully identifying all the different vocalizations of the parrot. So in 2024, my colleague, Dr. Vijay Ramesh, who's going to talk to you now about this study, we did a passive acoustic monitoring workshop in St. Vincent with the Forestry Department because they were basically the ones that were going to deploy the acoustic monitors and retrieve them and basically do all this project, collect all the data. So Dr. Ramesh is now going to tell you more about this study. And so yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ramesh and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cristina. Just trying to share my screen. It's not letting me share sounds, weirdly. That's a bit odd. All right. Okay. I'm guessing everyone can see the screen. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Cristina, for that wonderful presentation. I think I just want to briefly mention that before I continue talking, I was really fortunate to join this project in November last year. And a lot of the work over the last few decades has been done by forestry, and so I'm just really fortunate to work with some of the data that they've collected. And all of the results I'm presenting today is an outcome of all of their work that they've been doing to conserve this very important species. A bit about the center that I'm at. The Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics is a center within the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. For the past few decades now, we have three key pillars in terms of the work that we do. One is technology. So we build and invest in state-of-the-art technology to monitor species globally, and we provide open access software like Raven Pro and BirdNet to help analyze a lot of the audio data. We carry out state-of-the-art research in multiple realms, freshwater, marine, and terrestrial realms, and most importantly, a key pillar is also capacity sharing and engagement. And we believe that a lot of the work that we do is important. We believe that a lot of the work can be meaningful only if we engage with local collaborators, and we provide all the tools and techniques necessary to carry out effective monitoring of different species. To give you some context, this is just a map of some of the current ongoing acoustic projects where we are invested in and projects where we consult for to help achieve our partners' goals. I'm going to dive right in today to talking a bit more about what the pipeline generally looks for passive acoustic monitoring. Christina told you a bit about what this looks like in terms of why passive acoustic monitoring is important. But more broadly, what we usually do is we work with our collaborators and partners to first think about what the key research questions are to help co-create a study design. And using that, we inform our data collection, which has been ongoing in St. Vincent, which I'll tell you about briefly. And following that, we work towards data management because audio data is a lot of data. So there needs to be efficient ways to manage this and organize this. And using our software Raven Pro, we carry out manual analysis, and we also do automated analysis using the latest deep learning models. And finally, using all of this information, we're able to arrive at ecological insights, which we can then work with our partners to inform conservation and monitoring of said species. So in November 2024, we were able to carry out a workshop with the Forestry Department. And the idea was to talk a bit about how we can use passive acoustic monitoring with the Forestry Department to help monitor the St. Vincent Amazon. And what this workshop resulted in was real-time co-creation of a study design. So during the workshop, we were able to zoom into different locations, look at different gap and watch points, and figure out, okay, is this point in central range good for us to deploy our audio recorders? Or, is this particular location near the volcano in Windward North an ideal location to deploy a recorder for the St. Vincent Amazon? Or some locations further in the leeward side may also be points where we could deploy a recorder. So we spent multiple days working with the Forestry Department to figure out what locations might be ideal to monitor the St. Vincent Amazon. And these were all locations that the Forestry Department used to then carry out field work. And forestry agents deployed the AudioMoth audio recorders, a tiny recorder that fits in the palm of your hand, across all of the locations that I mentioned previously. And that resulted in a ton of data. So between November 2024 until June of this year, recorders were deployed across all of these locations. They were retrieved, and all of this audio data was carefully managed and organized. And what did that result in? And this is kudos to the Forestry Department. And you can see the amount of effort that's gone in terms of audio recorder deployments across months. In this plot that I'm showing you, on the y-axis on your left are survey point numbers, which are all those dots that I showed you in the map previously. And on the x-axis are acoustic recording dates with November 2024 on your left, going all the way to July 2025 on the right. And the colors, the orange lines, essentially represent each period of audio recording deployments. So you can see that different ranges, as you go from windward south all the way down to central, had different periods of audio recorded deployments. And this resulted in basically a ton of data being collected. And you can see across different ranges and points that in central range, we had over 500 days of audio data collected, whereas in windward south, we had almost 1,000 days of audio data. And so some of this variation is also because of logistical constraints in continuing to deploy and retrieve recorders, but also many of these recorders failed. So there were malfunctions in terms of the recorder not being able to collect data at some of these locations. But this resulted in over 3,300 days of recording. And yeah, even looking at that number, naturally, I'm like, that's a lot of data. So how do we use that data to actually detect this important species, the St. Vincent Amazon? And for the last decade now, there have been a lot of advancement in technology in terms of how we are able to carry out automated detections of different species. In 2010, initially there were template detectors for specific species that were being built. In 2015, there was an advancement with machine learning models that started coming up. And in 2020, we started seeing more of these deep learning and AI models. So BirdNet is one such AI model that has been is a tool and software that's built at the Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics that's openly available and accessible for researchers globally, researchers, conservation practitioners, anyone who'd like to use this. And now the field is moving further towards very large models called foundation models. So all of these are subsets of one another. And today I'll tell you a bit more about how we use BirdNet to carry out automated detections of this species. So how does it work essentially? So Forestry Department carried out a lot of audio recorder deployments. So they retrieved these recorders, and we then started looking at the acoustic data. And so here you can see a visualization of the sounds, which we call as spectrograms. On the y-axis is basically frequencies at which a species is vocalizing, and on the x-axis is basically time. And the spectrogram that you see here are basically signatures of the vocalization of the St. Vincent Amazon. Using Raven Pro, we were able to basically draw boxes around where the species is calling. And drawing these boxes is important because that's the basic unit of data that we'd feed to a deep learning model. And so how does it work? Basically, we feed what we call as training data. And for training data, we need information from what our target species is. And so that's the St. Vincent Amazon. So we create these clips that I showed you in the previous slide, and we tell the model that this is the target that we're looking for. At the same time, we feed in a lot of noise. So in the previous slide, you might have seen gaps between these vocalizations of the species. And that's the background that we tell BirdNet that there's no species here. Remember that, and ensure that when you run the model, you're not detecting a species there. At times, the model tends to confuse your target species with other species. So we also create separate labels and say that these are frogs and this is not the St. Vincent Amazon. And we take all of this data and feed it through BirdNet, and BirdNet runs its deep neural networks. We build a classifier, and then we have the final output. So it takes almost a day and a half to run because we're working with over 15,000 hours of data. And then I take all of this data and manually validate some of the detections. So what that looks like is I open Raven Pro, and then I go through many of these outputs that BirdNet gives me, and I say, okay, that's a parrot, that's a parrot, that's a parrot. That doesn't look like a parrot, that doesn't look like a parrot, and that's a parrot. And taking all of these manual validations, I'm able to basically figure out how well the model's doing and how often it's actually telling me, how often it's actually detecting a parrot when the parrot's present. And what we then do is a process called thresholding, where we start turning these BirdNet predictions into actual detections. So once I ran BirdNet, we had over 97,300 predictions of the St. Vincent Amazon. And BirdNet assigns basically different confidences associated with each of these predictions, and those confidences can go from 0 to 1. And you saw previously that I manually validated a lot of these predictions, and I can basically say that some of these were correct and some of these were wrong. Using that information on what is correct and what is wrong, I can basically turn these predictions into actual detections. And this is a process what we call thresholding. And to clarify that a bit further, what I can basically do is I can draw a line here, a vertical line, and say that anything to the right of that line are basically detections above that threshold, which means the parrot's present there. Anything to the left of that line is where the parrot was not detected. And so we're going to ignore all of those predictions. So you have all predictions to the right that we turn into detections and all the ones on the left that were removed. And so we did a similar process for the St. Vincent Amazon. And what that resulted in was a plot that looked like this, right? So you have your confidence scores on the x-axis that goes from 0 to 1. And on the y-axis is the probability that the prediction that BirdNet made is correct. And each of those vertical lines here tell you that there's a 95% probability that at that particular instance, anything to the right of it is accurate with a 95% probability. And when we set that particular threshold, we still ended up with over 80,000 detections of this species across the 8 months of data. So let's start exploring what these detections look like. And I can show you some interesting initial results that we retrieved. These are basically detections of the St. Vincent Amazon across sites and days. And I can walk you through it range by range, but I want to first tell you that on the left, on the y-axis are basically your survey point numbers. And on the x-axis is your timeline, which starts in November of 2024, going all the way up to late June 2025. And a pattern that you might first notice here is if you looked at the leeward range, you see a lot of detections of the St. Vincent Amazon at site PO33, and we can look at it spatially in a bit. But we also noticed that there were a lot of detections in Windward South as well at a few survey points. And the gaps here may refer to either times where the species was not detected or times where the recorder was not deployed in the first place. Now, if we start to look at the total or the cumulative acoustic detections across the island of St. Vincent between November to June of this year, you start seeing some interesting patterns spatially. So in this map that you see, you can see that the point PO33 in leeward, and if you see my cursor here, PO33 in leeward and PO16 had the highest numbers of acoustic detections. And I want to clarify that all of the visualizations I'm showing you control for effort in terms of the number of recording days. What's interesting here is that apart from certain sites having the highest numbers of acoustic detections, majority of the sites had detections of the parrot at some point or another. And yes, leeward range, the central forests in leeward range and windward south had the highest acoustic detections that I show you on the map. But it's still important to recognize that these detections were spatially distributed across the island, while there's some clustering going on in a few ranges. Now let's look at what happens when you look at it seasonally. We can spend some time looking at this particular visualization. This is basically an animation that takes you from November of 2024 all the way up to July of 2025. If we start in November, you see quite a bit of spatial clustering of acoustic detections in leeward and windward south. But then as you go to January, it's largely leeward, and then May and July and March, again, it's mostly leeward range. But What's interesting about this visualization is that there is seasonal variation in acoustic detections across the island of St. Vincent, and I think that's really important uh, for our understanding of how and where parrots are being detected across this island. And areas in black here largely represent areas where there were no deployments or very few detections of uh, the parrot. And lastly, I want to show you another plot here, uh, which is that this was when we started looking at detections per hour of the St. Vincent Amazon. And this was really interesting because I didn't tell you about our recorder configurations. We recorded data between 4 and 7 in the morning, and then again 10 to 2 in the afternoon, and between 5 and 7 in the evening. And what's fascinating here is that I keep talking about PO33, but you can see really high detections per hour uh, for PO33 early in the morning between 6 and 7. And again, you have a lot of detections between 5 and 6. This could potentially mean that these sites may be used as roost locations, which should be confirmed by visual observations on the ground. But temporal patterns of habitat use do give us some information about how these species are using certain locations across a given day over the entire period. With that, I'm going to briefly conclude my section of the talk, which is that I showed you that there were hotspots of acoustic detection, but that they varied spatially. Specifically, Central Forest and Leeward Range and Windward South reported the highest detections. Interestingly, there was seasonal variation in acoustic detections across ranges. And the time of day analysis that I showed you in the previous slide suggests that some locations could be potential roosting sites for the parrot. And importantly, I hope I've convinced you that acoustic monitoring can provide novel insights on parrot habitat use. And it's very important to also mention that our monitoring approach supports previous findings from forestry that Cristina was talking about. And lastly, I think integrating multiple conservation technologies is key for long-term monitoring of the parrot. I'll briefly end my talk by providing a few conservation action plan recommendations that Christina, Dan, and I came up with, which is that central forests in Leeward and Windward South Range are critical habitats for this species and should be conserved. Secondly, seasonal shifts or that seasonal variation in how the species is using multiple habitats across these ranges must be protected. And I think this is an important point here because uh, there are multiple sites across the island that's being used by the parrot, or these are sites where the species was detected, which means that it's not just that there are certain locations alone that are critical habitats, but it's important to think about how the seasonal variation in how these habitats are being used. And future work should analyze not just regional scale patterns, but also local finer scale patterns to better understand the seasonal variation in habitat use. How are these parrots using certain forests, or how are these parrots using certain plantations, for instance? And I think it's highly relevant that we integrate some of these conservation technologies like passive acoustic monitoring with traditional survey methods for carrying out effective long-term monitoring of the species. And lastly, any conservation action plan should uh, should be devised in a way where it's adaptive, where we have an adaptive management plan that takes into consideration uh, seasonal variation, how these habitats are being used, but also spatial variation in how some of these sites are being used by this particular parrot. With that, I want to thank uh, all of our collaborating and partner institutions that have been involved in this project, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Vijay and Christina, for those very interesting presentations. The acoustic monitoring data is really fascinating. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I will ask those of you and look forward to your responses. All right, Aaliyah is asking, Hi, Christina. Who were your enumerators for the survey? And can you tell us how different age groups defined importance? If there was a difference between like ecotourism, national symbol, etc. She's referring to your surveys that you did about the value of the parrot.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for that question. Aaliyah. Well, our data, I'm not entirely sure if you're asking about the interviews or surveys, but for the Amazon surveys, data was collected by the Forestry Department, rangers, and by students trained by the Forestry Department and myself. So a range of observers, and the data collected of the interviews was done mostly by our students. Let me see what else. Well, I can't recall right now I remember that for the interviews, we did find an effective age where a positive effective age on the value that people placed on the St. Vincent Amazon, but it wasn't a strong effect. I think that is the only effect that we found for age.
And by positive effect, you mean that younger people or older people had a more positive?
Right, older people placed a higher value on the parrot than you.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Okay. All right.
And we did suspect that it had to do with a lot of the sensitization that has been done in the past, but also to how much contact people tended to have with the forest itself. But of course, these are topics that need to be looked in more detail.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, a question from Justin Springer. He comments, interesting research. Thanks. Has there been any consideration of potentially incorporating more granular details of landscape and incorporating this into the landscape level analysis for parrot distribution? For example, presence of fruiting trees, food availability, presence of mature trees suitable for roosting.
Yeah. I think Dr. Daniel Gan would be best suited to answer that question. But basically, this started as evaluating the methods that forestry has used in the past, and so we went from very broad analysis of the data that we had at the time to more specifics. So Dr. Daniel Gan is now looking into landscape ecology. So I think he can now provide a few more details on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we started out, like Christina mentioned, initially with the flyover data, counting of the birds. And like she said, it was very difficult. It is very difficult to locate the birds where they're actually flying over or which part of the habitats they're more visiting, because we just see them flying by or we hear them. So it's not easy to do that part. So that's why we started out with the watershed level. We said, okay, we know that the birds are seen over within a specific watershed. And then we look at the broadest scale first and got all these variables generated for the watershed level. But as you said, I mean, in your question there, that's not really what helps us to identify which resources the parrots select, where those resources are, and what quantities. So right now, this year around, we're here and we're actually locating, we put acoustic monitors, the Swift models, in plantation, in natural forest, and we're planning on putting them more into farmlands as well to then see whether we can actually differentiate where the parrots at a more local scale are occupying, which parts of the landscape they're occupying. And then we can feed that acoustic data together with the land cover data that we have, and at different scales see which aspects of the heterogeneity of the landscape actually might affect the higher visitation of the parrots and visitations. So that's a good question, but we're working towards it. It's just step by step, going from the very broad scale of finer and finer scales. So we're on the way to go there. But if you have ideas on how we should approach this, please feel free to send us a message and let's talk about that.
Great, thank you. Do the parrots ever move or disperse across watersheds? Mike Akresh is asking. Do you know?
That's really interesting, and we're very curious to know as well how parrots move across the island and whether there are distinct subpopulations, how, so we want to move towards doing telemetry, but of course that has a lot of difficulties as well. So we actually have no idea of how they move across watersheds. We imagine that they do. I mean, they're completely capable of moving from one side of the island to the other. I mean, maybe the only barrier would be the central ridge if they don't fly over it, but I can imagine they do, but we have no evidence for it yet.
And
I want to add.
I would just like to add to that we have actually from the spatial models of Vijay that he presented, we see that the hotspots are actually moving over the month from the east to the west and so on. So it does suggest that there is probably an accumulation some month concentration on one side that might have to do with some migratory activity from the east to the west and back. So, but we don't know for sure. Like, could just be that they're hiding somewhere else where the monitors were on the other side, right? But who knows?
Okay, thank you. Somebody else is asking, what is the detection range of the acoustic recording unit?
I can take that. So I think it really varies on in which habitat you deploy them in. Sometimes if you deploy them in very open habitat, you can detect something as far away as like 100 or 120 meters. But often these audio mods in really dense habitat, they're not detecting anything beyond 50 meters. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we have a question from Jane Hackinson in the Cayman Islands. Great presentation, thank you. We continue to use distance sampling for both our subpopulations of Amazon, as it is my understanding that population numbers are very hard to get from acoustic monitoring. Is that correct? Also, how many different categories of parrot calls did you define? Call, song, flight call, distress call, and so on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think right now the field is trying to move towards asking if we can actually get at population numbers using audio data, but at the moment we're not able to do that. We can only confirm if there's a presence or there's no detection. Even getting a true absence is hard unless we do repeated sampling. For this particular data that we presented, we didn't distinguish between the types of calls because we had limited training data to work with, and we told the model that all of this is part of the vocal repertoire of the St. Vincent Amazon.
Thanks. And Kamal Islam is asking, do you have any idea of historical population sizes of the St. Vincent Amazon? The surveyed populations appear to show a stable trend. Have we reached carrying capacity for this species?
I think the silence of everyone answers that question, and I don't think we have data to really show whether we've reached carrying capacity. So really, I don't think we have information on that yet. So hopefully, through more detailed data, we'll get to answer that question at some point.
Fair enough. All right, and Faraz Abdul is asking, how is a species appropriateness for PAM evaluated? As in, is there any way to decide whether PAM is better suited for one species as opposed to another, aside from the species being vocal or not?
Yeah, this is difficult because I think vocal activities being if a species has a vocalization that's fairly loud in amplitude, that's far easier for the models to detect. Sometimes the species that often vocalize at lower frequencies, they tend to work better in these models. So for example, if you're looking at the broad-winged hawk that Christina was playing earlier, uh, I don't know how often they vocalize, but also they're moving across large ranges. So uh, unless you're getting a lot of data for the species, some of these automated approaches may not be the best way forward for some of these raptors. So I think it's very species specific. I don't think there's one answer for this. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, and a question from Fitzgerald Providence, who's the recently retired director of the Forestry Department. In the watershed approach, could we determine the elevation range for their roosting and feeding? There's very little habitat above 1,000 meters as that is open woodland. I guess he's asking, is there a different elevation range for their roosting and feeding? Or could you determine that?
I don't think we have the data to determine that, but Dan, do you want to comment further? Again, I just want to stress that this is very preliminary data, and the first couple years, so 2022 and 23, sorry, 21 and 22 and 23 was our effort to understand the value of the watch point surveys done by forestry and how we could best analyze it, because it's such a broad data set that it's so valuable, so many years of continuous monitoring of the species. So trying to analyze it as best as we could and gain the largest amount of information to inform management and the conservation action plan. And from then on, our efforts to understand, well, what of the survey methods available would be best applied to the species. So really, we are at a very early stage here, understanding how to move forward. So unfortunately, we don't yet have the information to answer a lot of these questions, but we're getting there. And the other thing I just wanted to also mention is that just appreciate again Mr. Providence and everyone at the Forestry Department for all of the support that they've given us, but as well our colleagues and all the students that participated in this project. I don't have time to mention all of them, but there were at least 10 different students that collected data, analyzed data, and worked on this project for many years. So yeah, work in progress.
Definitely. Thanks, Christina. All right, another attendee asks, are you able to differentiate between the types of calls of the parrots, and that this could help identify nest sites or popular feeding areas?
I think someone who knows the ecology of the species can talk to it better. But for the data that we presented, we had very limited training data to work with. So it didn't make sense for us to distinguish or differentiate between them for the sake of this particular project. But I'm hoping that given all of the detections that have been made, one could go through them and try to distinguish between different vocalizations. So if there are any eager students who want to work on this, that would be great. Yeah.
And I also wanted to add to that many of the officers of the Forestry Department have a lot of expertise and can definitely distinguish and identify specific calls of the St. Vincent Parrot. And so they were of enormous help in identifying vocalizations and starting to create a library, a repertoire of vocalizations of the species.
Great. All right, Kamal is asking, are nest site locations a limiting factor in the increase of parrot populations?
Potentially, definitely that could be the case, and the Forestry Department does put out nest boxes during breeding season. So in February they start putting out nest boxes because of that. So it could be a limited factor, but there isn't any data showing that this could be the case. But definitely mature trees or cavities are a scarce resource. So it could be.
Okay, and Mike Akrash is asking, when are ARUs put out at other locations, for example, agriculture or tree plantations?
So we just started this year now to look at a more fine scale, like I said, resource selection of the pairs to see if we can differentiate whether we have higher occupancy in plantations versus natural forest or vice versa. And then we also have suggested to do along transects from high density farmland into the forests across the different ecotones. To do that next year with the participation of forestry to get permissions and collaboration with farmers. So that takes a little bit more effort to get into that, but we started doing that. And so this year we deployed 10 units, half of them in plantations and the other half in natural forests and in the vicinity. So to see whether there is a difference within the same region.
Excellent. Yeah, that'll be very interesting data to look at as well. So I think that's it for our questions. I want to thank our speakers again today. The data that you've analyzed thus far is really fascinating, and I know you have so much more to do, so we'll look forward to hearing your results in the coming months. And I know that the monitoring is going to continue, so there's going to be thousands and thousands of hours of data to analyze. So it's going to be exciting to see that in the future. And yeah, these data are really valuable. We're going to be having the Conservation Action Plan workshop in St. Vincent next week for this species. So we look forward to Cristina and Vijay giving shorter presentations with the highlights at the workshop and using some of your recommendations for the CAP process. So thanks again to our speakers. Many, many thanks to Efren for his help with interpretation. And Adrian, our executive director, who is recording the Spanish language version of this webinar on her laptop. And we will post this webinar on our YouTube probably either later tonight or by tomorrow morning, first thing, so that we can share it with everybody that's coming to the workshop if they were not able to attend the live webinar. So thanks again to everybody, and have a great weekend.